Stalingrad, Hitler's one-week promise, an army's tomb. The steppe wind knows no pity. It is an ice-forged blade that cuts through the worn wool of uniforms, finds every crack in the shattered masonry, and howls like a lost soul through the empty streets. For the German soldier huddled in the cellar of what was once an apartment building, this wind is but one more torment in a hell of infinite torments. His name has ceased to matter. He is just another part of the vast, dying organism of the Sixth Army. Outside, wide, the snow is not white. It is a filthy crust, gray and brown, stained by the soot of perpetual fires and the blood that freezes almost instantly upon hitting the ground. The world has shrunk to this labyrinth of rubble. Twisted steel girders reach for a lead-colored sky like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts. Jagged walls offer precarious cover, but they also hide the enemy, ever watchful. Hunger is a dull, constant ache in the gut. The daily ration is a slice of hard bread, sometimes with a sliver of frozen horse meat. The men look at the remaining horses not as draft animals, but as the promise of a few more days of life. The cold is a more insidious foe. It creeps into their boots, numbing their fingers until they turn black and dead with gangrene. The simple act of working a rifle bolt becomes an agony. The wounded no longer scream much. They lie on makeshift cots in frozen cellars, their breath forming vapor clouds in the frigid air. The doctor, his eyes sunken with exhaustion, has no more morphine. He has no more clean bandages. He can only offer a hollow word of comfort before moving on to the next man waiting for his turn to die. Hope has become the scarcest resource of all, more precious than ammunition or food. Every day is a repetition of the last. A grayish dawn reveals the same landscape of desolation. Then the symphony of death begins. The sharp whistle of a mortar shell, followed by the blast that rains down rubble and shrapnel. The dry, nervous chatter of an MG-42 machine gun, answered by the deeper thud of a Soviet Degtyaryov. And sometimes, the most terrifying sound of all, a single, sharp crack, a sniper's shot. A man who stands to stretch his stiffened muscles collapses without a sound, a small hole in his head. This is the Rattenkrieg, the war of rats, a term coined in contempt and frustration, but now accepted with grim resignation. The fight is for every room, every flight of stairs, every hole in the floor. The enemy is not hundreds of meters away, across a no-man's land. He is on the other side of the wall, on the floor above, in the sewer tunnel running beneath your feet. Sometimes you can hear his hacking cough, or the murmur of his voice in a strange tongue. Months ago, in the heat of summer, these same men marched towards this city with the arrogance of conquerors. Stalingrad, they were told, would fall in a week, a promise made by the Führer himself. Now, trapped in the jaws of a Russian winter they were never equipped for, in a city that refuses to die, that promise is a distant echo, a cruel, bitter joke whispered in the dark corners, just before the cold and hunger claim another victim. The Volga River at their backs is an impassable barrier of ice and fire, and beyond it, there is only more steppe, more snow, more Russia. The encirclement is absolute. There is no escape. There is only the wait for the end. To understand the magnitude of this catastrophe, we must go back in time, to the summer of 1942, to the grand strategy that set millions of men in motion. The German plan had a name, Fall Blau, Operation Blue. Its objective was not a city, but the most vital resource for a modern war, oil. The black gold of the Caucasus was the lifeblood of the Nazi war machine. Without it, the panzers would grind to a halt, the planes would be grounded, and the Reich would suffocate. In this grand strategic design, Stalingrad was, initially, a secondary objective, an industrial city on the banks of the Volga. Its capture would serve to anchor the northern flank of the main advance to the south. Seizing it would protect the long, vulnerable supply line of the armies driving into the Caucasus. It was a point on the map, a logistical task, not the center of gravity for the summer campaign. But war rarely adheres to the logic of planners. And for Adolf Hitler, geography was subordinate to ideology and obsession. The city's name became a magnet for his ego. Stalingrad. Stalin's city. The capture of this place ceased to be a military necessity and became a personal affront, a symbolic duel between two tyrants fighting for the souls of their nations. The propaganda machine could not resist such a prize. Thus, Operation Blue changed course. Vital panzer divisions were diverted from the main push into the Caucasus. Overwhelming air power was concentrated on a single point on the map. Stalin's city had to be erased. Its name expunged from history by the force of German arms. Strategy had become a vendetta. At the head of this mission was General Friedrich Paulus. He was the archetype of the Prussian general staff officer, methodical, intelligent, a master of logistics and planning. Paulus had been one of the architects of Operation Barbarossa, a highly respected desk strategist, but he was not a field commander. He lacked the brutal initiative, the intuitive feel for the chaos of combat that defined great battlefield leaders. His greatest quality, and his most fatal flaw, was a loyalty to the orders of his superiors, and ultimately, of the Führer himself, that bordered on paralysis. He was tormented by his responsibility to his men, but terrified at the thought of disobeying a direct order. Paulus was the perfect instrument to execute a plan, but the worst possible commander for a battle that would demand improvisation, boldness, and, at times, judicious insubordination. He was a planner forced into a war of attrition for which he was neither psychologically nor doctrinally prepared. This lack of flexibility was mirrored throughout the German high command. The lightning victories of previous years had bred a dangerous arrogance. They had come to believe their own myth of invincibility. They grossly underestimated the Soviet will to resist and their capacity to mobilize new reserves. Nazi propaganda was already announcing the fall of Stalingrad, while the armored spearheads were barely reaching its suburbs. They had become blind to the danger gathering around them, and the danger was immense. The Sixth Army's advance had created a salient hundreds of kilometers deep. Its flanks, stretched across the open, featureless steppe, were its Achilles' heel, and they were not defended by the elite of the Wehrmacht. The task of protecting these vast, vulnerable expanses fell to Germany's allies, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, the 8th Italian Army, and the 2nd Hungarian Army. These formations were ill-equipped, with obsolete anti-tank weaponry, insufficient artillery, and fragile morale. Their soldiers were fighting a war they did not understand, for an ally they secretly disdained. They were an eggshell protecting the flank of a steel hammer. The German high command knew this weakness, but in their hubris, they dismissed it. They believed the Red Army was finished, incapable of mounting a large-scale counteroffensive. So, while Paulus and his planners focused with tunnel vision on conquering streets and buildings inside Stalingrad, the Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov and his staff were looking at a much larger map. They did not see a city to be defended, but an entire army to be trapped. While the Germans counted the city blocks they had taken, the Soviets were quietly counting the tanks and men they were massing on the steppe. They drew lines on their maps that did not cut through squares or factories, but that encircled over 250,000 men. The stage for the greatest trap in military history was set. Inside the smoking ruins of Stalingrad, autumn bled into an early winter. Every day was a butchery. General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, directed the defense from a bunker dug into the steep bank of the Volga. He was a man forged by hardship, a peasant's son with a legendary stubbornness etched into every line of his face. His men called him General Stubbornness, and his command philosophy was as brutally simple as the battle itself. We will defend the city or die here. Chuikov had learned urban warfare not in an academy, but on the streets of China as a military advisor. He understood that in a labyrinth of rubble, Germany's air and artillery superiority could be neutralized. His tactic was simple and suicidal: hug the enemy. Keep his lines so unbearably close to the Germans that the Luftwaffe could not bomb the Soviets without risking the annihilation of their own men. This forced the combat down to knife-fighting range, to a struggle of grenades and bayonets where the raw determination of his soldiers could prevail. While Chuikov and his men were bleeding the Sixth Army white in the Rattenkrieg, a drama on a much grander scale was unfolding in secret. Far from the city's din, on the vast, silent steppes to the north and south, the Red Army was gathering. Under a veil of the strictest secrecy and deception, Marshal Zhukov had assembled a colossal force. Over 1 million men. Thousands of tanks and artillery pieces had slipped into position, awaiting the signal. The plan had a code name: Operation Uranus. The morning of November 19th, 1942, arrived with a thick, freezing fog. Then the world exploded. Thousands of cannons and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously, an apocalyptic roar that shook the earth for hundreds of kilometers. The target of this hurricane of steel was not the Sixth Army in Stalingrad, but its vulnerable flanks. The ill-equipped Romanian divisions, frozen and terrified, were the first to feel the blow. The assault was of unimaginable violence. Waves of Soviet T-34 tanks emerged from the mist, infantry clinging to their hulls, and smashed into the thin Romanian lines. The defenders' anti-tank guns were useless against the T-34's sloped armor. The lines buckled, then shattered. Panic spread like wildfire. Entire units disintegrated, fleeing to the rear in a chaotic rout. Within hours, the northern and southern flanks of the Stalingrad salient had ceased to exist. Two gigantic Soviet pincers now drove unopposed across the steppe, racing towards each other, aiming to close the trap behind the Sixth Army. On November 23rd, just 4 days after the offensive began, the armored spearheads of the southwestern and Stalingrad fronts met near the small town of Kalak. The ring was closed. Over 250,000 soldiers of the German Sixth Army, the cream of the Wehrmacht, were completely surrounded. At Paulus's headquarters, initial disbelief gave way to panic. The incoming reports were confused, then catastrophic. Communication with the flank units was lost. Paulus, the meticulous planner, was confronted with a scenario for which he had no plan. His instinct, and that of his shrewdest generals, told him the only salvation was to order an immediate breakout to the west, to abandon Stalingrad, and fight their way out before the Soviet encirclement could solidify. But for that, he needed Hitler's permission. The message sent to the Eagle's Nest was clear. The Sixth Army was surrounded and requested freedom of action to attempt a breakout. The reply that came back was unequivocal, a decree issued from a parallel reality where willpower could bend facts. The Sixth Army was to hold its positions at all costs. The Führer would not yield a single meter of captured ground, and he promised a solution. The army would be supplied by air, a promise made by the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, a man whose arrogance was surpassed only by his incompetence. The decision that sealed the fate of 250,000 men was not made on a tactical map, but in the delusional mind of a dictator 1,500 kilometers away. The tension of the moment was unbearable. An entire army, which had arrived as a conqueror at the gates of Asia, now stared into an empty sky, waiting for a miracle that would never come, trapped between the orders of a madman and the iron grip of an enemy they had fatally underestimated. The greatest battle of annihilation in the war was about to begin. If this chronicle of an army's collapse and a world war's turning point seems fascinating, consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a like. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these epic stories, and in doing so, you'll ensure you don't miss the detailed analysis of the hell that was about to be unleashed inside the cauldron of Stalingrad. The closing of the encirclement, christened the Kessel, the cauldron by the Germans, transformed the battle for Stalingrad. The fight for the city came to an abrupt halt. The priority was no longer to advance, but to survive. For the men of the Sixth Army, the world shrank to the confines of their pocket, a frozen perimeter defended with what ammunition and food they had left. The Luftwaffe's promise of a massive airlift operation quickly proved to be a tragic fantasy. The airfields inside the Kessel became the umbilical cord connecting the army to life, but they were under constant bombardment from Soviet artillery and attacks by the Red Air Force. The Junkers 52 transports, slow and vulnerable, were shot down in droves. On good days, a fraction of the 500 tons of daily supplies that Paulus had calculated as the bare minimum for survival arrived. On bad days, nothing arrived at all. Inside the Kessel, life disintegrated into a primal struggle. The horses were the first to be slaughtered, their stringy, frozen meat a luxury. Soon, men began boiling the leather from their belts to make a wretched soup. Starvation became the norm. Cheeks grew hollow, eyes became glassy. The cold was a relentless torturer. Temperatures dropped to 30 Fahm, then 40 degrees below zero. Sentries froze to death at their posts. The engines of the few vehicles with fuel refused to start. Weapons jammed. Meanwhile, outside the ring, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant strategists, hastily assembled a relief force. Operation Winter Storm, led by the 4th Panzer Army, was launched in mid-December. It was a desperate race against time. Manstein's panzers pushed across the frozen steppe, battling their way through fierce Soviet resistance. For one brief, agonizing moment, it seemed a miracle was possible. Manstein's spearheads reached to within just 48 kilometers of the Kessel's perimeter. The trapped soldiers could see the flash of cannons on the horizon, could hear the distant rumble of combat. Hope, almost extinguished, flared again. Manstein sent a message to Paulus. He must launch a breakout operation codenamed Thunderclap to link up with the relief force. It was the last chance. But Paulus, tormented by indecision and chained by Hitler's orders not to abandon Stalingrad, hesitated. He demanded a direct order from the Führer, an order he knew would never come. He argued that his panzers did not have enough fuel to cover the 48 kilometers. The window of opportunity slammed shut as quickly as it had opened. The Red Army, recovering from the initial shock, threw its own reserves against Manstein's flank, forcing him to halt and then to slowly retreat. The last glimmer of hope was gone. For the men in the Kessel, the failure of the relief operation was the psychological death blow. They knew now they were abandoned. January 1943 was a month of unspeakable agony. The Red Army, having crushed any external threat, began to tighten the noose. Their new offensive, Operation Ring, had one simple objective: the systematic annihilation of the pocket. They used a tactic of squeezing and dividing. An artillery bombardment of a previously unseen intensity would pulverize the German lines. Then, waves of infantry and tanks would attack, carving the Kessel into smaller, more manageable pieces. German resistance, though desperate, was futile. The soldiers, weakened by hunger and cold, could barely hold their weapons. Ammunition was scarce. A private named Hans, in a forward post near the Potomnik airfield, watched his world fall apart. For weeks, his platoon had defended a frozen trench. He saw his comrades die one by one, not just from enemy bullets, but from typhus, dysentery, and simple exposure. One day, after a barrage that seemed to last an eternity, he saw T-34 tanks advancing through the smoke. He fired his rifle until it was empty. Then he waited, huddled at the bottom of his trench, for the end. He felt no fear, only a profound and absolute exhaustion. In the southern part of the pocket, in the ruins of the Red October factory, the last defenders fought in a surreal landscape of shattered machinery and twisted steel. Sergeant Klaus, a veteran of the French campaign, led a handful of men. Their only heavy weapon was an MG-42 mounted on a pile of bricks. They fought for 3 days, moving from one heap of rubble to another, ambushing the advancing Soviets. When they were finally cornered in a cellar, Klaus had only a pistol with 3 bullets left. He used one for the Soviet officer who opened the door, and the other 2 for himself. Even in desperation, there were acts of individual heroism. A Luftwaffe pilot, defying orders, landed his small Fieseler Storch aircraft in the midst of the chaos to evacuate a wounded general. A group of combat engineers, armed only with demolition charges, threw themselves at a column of Soviet tanks, destroying 3 before being annihilated. They were spasms of futile bravery, the last defiance of a dying army. The relentless storm of the Red Army would not be stopped. The cauldron was about to be boiled dry. The end, when it came, was a disintegration. By late January, the Kessel had fractured into 2 isolated pockets, one in the north, centered on the ruins of the tractor factory, and a smaller one in the south, in the city center. Organized resistance had ceased. Now there were only pockets of men, hiding in cellars and sewers, fighting not for the Reich or the Führer, but for one more hour of life. On January 30th, 1943, the anniversary of his rise to power, Hitler sent one last message to Friedrich Paulus. He promoted him to the rank of Field Marshal. It was not an honor. It was a veiled command. No German field marshal in history had ever surrendered. The expectation was clear. Paulus was to commit suicide, denying the enemy the satisfaction of capturing such a high-ranking leader and, in his death, creating a final myth of heroic resistance. But Paulus was not a Nazi fanatic. He was a broken Prussian officer, a man who had seen the suffering of his soldiers firsthand. Suicide, to him, was not an honorable option but a final desertion of his duty to the men he had left. The next day, January 31st, a gaunt and sickly Paulus surrendered to officers of the Soviet 64th Army in the basement of the Univermag department store, his final headquarters. The news of the surrender spread by radio. In the north, General Karl Strecker, commanding the remaining pocket, issued his final message. The 11th Army Corps has done its duty to the last man. Long live the Führer. Then, on February 2nd, his exhausted, ammunitionless troops laid down their arms. The silence that fell over Stalingrad was, for many, more deafening than the 6 months of ceaseless combat. The battle was over. The impact of this defeat was an earthquake that shook the foundations of the Third Reich. The destruction of an entire army, the Sixth Army, considered one of the finest formations in the Wehrmacht, was a military catastrophe of unprecedented scale. It created a gigantic vacuum on the Eastern Front, a hole hundreds of kilometers wide that the Germans would never fully manage to close. To prevent a total collapse of the entire southern sector, they were forced into a hasty withdrawal of their armies from the Caucasus, abandoning the original strategic objective of the entire summer campaign, the oil. But the psychological impact was even more profound. For the first time in the war, Goebbels's propaganda machine could not hide the magnitude of the disaster. 3 days of national mourning were declared. German radio stopped playing music, replacing it with somber classical compositions. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility, the pillar upon which the morale of the German people rested, was shattered. In private diaries and whispered conversations across Germany, a question began to form. If the mighty Sixth Army could be annihilated, who was safe? Doubt, like a virus, began to spread. For the Soviet troops, the victory was a morale injection of incalculable power. They had stopped the German steamroller at Moscow, but at Stalingrad they had destroyed it. The soldiers of the Red Army, who for a year and a half had known little but retreat and defeat, now saw endless columns of German prisoners, once their arrogant masters, marching into captivity, shivering and hollow-eyed. The news spread like wildfire across the entire front, instilling a new confidence and a relentless determination in every soldier. They now knew the enemy was not invincible. They knew they could win. The frustration and rage in the German high command were palpable. Blame was distributed generously. Hitler blamed Paulus for his cowardice in surrendering. Goering was blamed for the Luftwaffe's failure. But the inescapable truth was that the defeat was a product of hubris, of underestimating the enemy, and of the obsessive interference of a leader who had mistaken strategy for his own megalomaniacal fantasies. The German war machine had suffered a wound from which it would never fully recover. The turning point had been reached. The long, bloody road to Berlin had begun on the banks of the Volga. When the last shot faded and the smoke cleared over the ruins of Stalingrad, the scale of the slaughter was revealed in all its brutality. The figures were, and remain, almost incomprehensible. The Axis had suffered around 850,000 casualties in the entire campaign leading up to and including the encirclement. This includes killed, wounded, and captured. Of the approximately 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered in the final days, fate was cruel. They were marched to prison camps in the frozen depths of the Soviet Union. Weakened by months of starvation and disease, many died on the way. Of that proud force of 91,000 men, only 5,000 to 6,000 would ever see Germany again, released years after the war had ended. The Sixth Army had, quite simply, ceased to exist. Soviet casualties were even more catastrophic. It is estimated that over 1,130,000 of their soldiers and officers were killed, wounded, or captured during the battle. To this must be added the tens of thousands of civilians who perished in the initial bombing and during the street fighting. Stalingrad was not just a military victory, it was a blood sacrifice of biblical proportions, a testament to the almost limitless suffering the Soviet people were willing to endure to defend their motherland. In the long term, Stalingrad is universally recognized as the decisive turning point of the Second World War on the European front. It was more than a battle. It was the end of the beginning and the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. From February 1943 onwards, the strategic initiative passed irrevocably to the Red Army. The Wehrmacht was forced into a permanent defensive posture in the east, reacting to Soviet blows rather than delivering them. The victory at Stalingrad unleashed the industrial and human might of the Soviet Union. The Red Army, battle-hardened and possessing unparalleled combat experience, began a series of almost uninterrupted offensives that would drive the Germans westwards, across Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, in a relentless advance that would only stop 2 years and 3 months later, in the smoking ruins of Berlin. The legacy of the men who fought there became legend. Vasily Chuikov, general stubbornness, survived the war and became a marshal of the Soviet Union. He asked to be buried on Mamayev Kurgan, the highest point in Stalingrad and the scene of some of the most ferocious fighting, so that he could lie beside the soldiers he commanded who died defending the city. Friedrich Paulus became a tragic figure. In Soviet captivity, he became an outspoken critic of the Nazi regime, urging German soldiers to surrender. For Hitler, his name became synonymous with treason. He never returned to favor with anyone and died in East Germany in 1957, a man haunted by the ghosts of an army he had led to annihilation. Today, the city, renamed Volgograd, bears the scars and monuments of its epic past. Places like Pavlov's house or the grain elevator are secular shrines. The gigantic statue, the motherland calls, her sword raised high atop Mamayev Kurgan, dominates the skyline, a perpetual reminder of the sacrifice made on its slopes. Stalingrad became more than a battle. It transformed into a universal symbol of resistance against tyranny, of the human spirit's capacity to endure the unendurable and, ultimately, to prevail. It was in this hell of ice and fire that the hubris of Nazism was broken, and where Hitler's promise of a one-week victory became the tomb of his most powerful army.